street, I am told, is paved with pure gold, and the sun it shall never go down.
All right, chapter 20 and verse 18. It says, and all the people perceived the thunder and the lightning flashes and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood at a distance. Then they said to Moses, speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But let not God speak to us, lest we die. And Moses said to the people, do not be afraid, for God has come in order to test you, in order that the fear of him might remain with you, so that you may not sin. So the people stood at a distance while Moses approached the thick cloud where God was. So what's the main point, I guess is the way I'll say it, of verses 18 through 21? Okay, God has come down to the mountain. His presence has been perceived. And that's a somewhat significant word, perceived. Some translations will say saw, but we tend to associate that word with eyesight, and there's more involved than just that. They perceived the thunder, it says. Thunder is primarily not visual, but what? Audible. And what else can it be? It can be kinetic. It can rattle the building, and you can feel thunder if it's close enough and powerful enough. And so there's those other senses. Perception is to become aware of, to grasp a hold of something, to be aware of something, to be convinced of something as a result of your senses. And so that's what's going on here. They have come into contact with the thunder, with the lightning flashes, with the sound of the trumpet, with the mountain smoking. And it says they trembled and stood at a distance. And so they get all this tactile feedback of the presence of God. And what did it cause in them? Fear. Which is an interesting thing. When we're first introduced to God, and we've got to go way back. Way back. Genesis chapter 3, at the beginning of it. God is in the garden. His presence is known to Adam and Eve have no fear of him at all. There's no shame, there's no fear, there's no enmity between them and God at all. And then what happens? They sin. And so verses 8 through 10, God comes into the garden on the other side of sin, and what do? They are ashamed, and they hide themselves because they're afraid of him. All right, so Moses in chapter 3 and verse 6, when he comes to the burning bush, it says that he hid his face and was afraid to look at God. Now we have this situation here in Exodus 20, verses 18 through 20, where the people were afraid of God. Now, why was God coming down in this instance anyway? Okay. And what was the purpose? Really to enter into a covenant. The law was part of the covenant, but to enter into a covenant, and to enter into a covenant between himself and the people. He was actually coming down to engage with them, to fellowship with them. But they're afraid of him. Was he coming down to judge them? No, he was coming down to receive them and to communicate to them. Does it mean something special when someone takes the time to communicate with you personally? And God is taking the time to communicate to man personally. His presence appears on the mountain. Now, there's some caution that has to be put into place, and we've read about some of that already, because his presence is so grand, that we can't behold him with our eyes, I guess is the way I'll approach it at this point. But he was coming as a friend. If this was a campy B-movie alien show, it would be I Come in Peace. He was coming, and that they were terrified of him. To the point that they said to Moses, you go talk to him, and we'll just stand over here. Gideon in Judges chapter 6 sees the angel of the Lord. Almost always when you see that phrase, the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament, it's talking about an appearance of the pre-incarnate Christ. He sees the angel of the Lord, and he feared for his life, and God has to reassure him that he's not going to die. Manoah, which is Samson's father in Judges 13, feared that he and his wife would die after encountering the Lord. Isaiah in Isaiah 6 is overwhelmed with fear and feels unworthy and sinful in the presence of God. Ezekiel in Ezekiel 1 falls on his face in fear when he saw the glory of God. The apostles during the transfiguration in Matthew chapter 17, verses 5 and 6. What is those three apostles? What's their initial reaction? Well, they fell to the ground out of fear. So this is not an unusual response in some ways. When God makes his glory known, what does it do? It causes fear in man. Fear in man who understands, now in a very visceral way, the greatness of God, the power of God, the majesty of God, the glory of God. And conversely, how little man is and how weak we are and our sin. And when we come face to face with those things, it does strike fear. Why does it strike fear? Well, what's the wages of sin? Death. What happens if we see God? What did God say? If man saw me, what would happen? He would die. So it's sort of a natural thing. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Their liberation from the Egyptians, they saw the power of God. They could see what he could do, what potential God had for mankind. He could kill them all.
Right.
So that also is probably in their mind.
So they've seen the plagues. They've seen the Red Sea. Now, this is important. You gotta tuck this away in your mind. Don't put it way back in the long-term memory. Keep it in the accessible short-term memory. But as we read on, we're going to get to some other events that happen, and we're going to start asking ourselves the question, wait a minute, if they're aware of the greatness of God and the majesty of God and the power of God, why would they do that? See, at this point, they're afraid to approach God, and they send Moses in their stead. That's what it says. So the people stood at a distance while Moses approached. By the way, what does that say about Moses? How much courage did he have? He did. And why did he have that different relationship with God? Right. And what does that portend for us? Again, we want to read all this through the lens of, what does this mean for me? Moses was able to approach God. Why was Moses able to approach God? Okay, he had faith. He had a relationship with him. And we can boldly go before the throne of grace. Even more so than Moses, because what do we have the benefit of? Christ. That sacrifice, forgiveness, the mediation that he provides, none of which Moses knew about yet. Would Moses benefit from all those things? Yes, eventually. But he knows about none of them. We have the benefit of that knowledge. And yet oftentimes we appear to be afraid to approach God. Verse 22, the Lord said to Moses, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen that I have spoken to you from heaven. You've become aware, you now know that I myself, God, have communicated with you. What does that mean? And again, we talked about it just a few moments ago. How significant is it when someone takes the trouble to come to you to communicate with you? And to do it face to face. I'll tell a story on myself. I'm good at telling stories on myself. There's a lot of them. When I was a freshman in college, my very first semester in college, I was a music major. And I was called upon to perform a solo in a recital during that semester. And I was displeased with my performance. But the head of the music department got up out of his seat in the middle of the recital, walked around backstage, and came to me to commend me on my performance. We won't talk about my response and the fact that I got yelled at a couple of days later for that response. We're just talking about the fact that the head of the music department, who in just a few years would be dean of the college and then president of the university, got up, took the time to seek me out, find me, and address me and speak to me. And what I was basically told, by the way, a couple of days later was, he doesn't give away compliments for nothing. You need to learn how to say thank you. I'm a lot better at saying thank you than I used to be. It still works. But here's my point. That meant something. This means something. That God brought his presence down, made man aware, I am speaking to you. He would do that again on a few occasions. At the birth of Jesus, coming in the flesh and living as a man, God with us. There's that opening of the heavens and the announcement from the heavens of what has taken place. Then there is the event where he once again at his baptisms says, this is my son, hear him. And yet again, that event happens where he would say that. And then there's the earthquakes and all the things that accompanied his death and resurrection. The darkness and all that awareness of the presence of God, the power of God on the earth, so that man would recognize that God took the time to come down here, not just come down here, but come down here and take humanity upon himself and live as a man so that he could die for us. Significant. This is very significant. This is not the first time that God communicated with someone after Eden, but the first time he made his presence known like this. You shall not make other gods besides me. Now, he's already dealt with idolatry and graven images in the Ten Commandments, right? Which he just made known to them. That's the first half of this chapter. You shouldn't have a graven image. Idolatry is not appropriate. You shall have no other gods before me. That's where it all starts, right? So why does he visit this again so quickly? You shall make no other God besides me. Okay.
You know, if they feared God as much as this scribes, which Evan was significant, then they might be prone to avoid him by making God they felt they could control, but felt more comfortable and at ease with, and with Jehovah God himself.
All right. Now I'm gonna to use the benefit of multiple translations here. I know the ESV says with me instead of besides. Anybody reading from another translation? New King James, the NIV, the CSB. New King James, what's it say? With me. All right. There's some debate about what the right word to use is. The Hebrew word is to rival me. Okay, that's an interesting translation. The whole idea, I'm gonna be honest with you. I don't know, but that this isn't a foreshadowing and portending about what would happen when Moses went up on the mountain and spent 40 days apart for them, and they got afraid with Moses' absence. And then what did they do? They made an idol. Yeah, they made an idol, but they didn't say this is a different God. They made an idol and said what? This is the God that delivered us out of Egypt. And so the idea here is not a separate God necessarily, but a false identification of God. They're afraid of the real presence of God, but they can't stand to not have something present to represent God. But he's told them, don't make graven images.
So it's like they're not comfortable with completely abandoning God, but they've constructed an idea of God that they're more comfortable with.
That is a very astute observation. Did everybody hear what he said? Not necessarily creating a new God, but creating a new idea, their idea. An idea about what God is. Now, keep that in mind as we read these next couple of verses, because I think you'll see some of the same ideas being echoed here. Okay, so he goes on to say, you shall make no other gods beside me, gods of silver or gods of gold. You shall not make for yourselves. You shall not make an altar. You shall not. I got knots on. You shall make an altar of earth for me, and you shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings, and your peace offerings, and your sheep, and your oxen. By the way, he hasn't given them any of the laws pertaining to the sacrifices and all that stuff yet. I think that we have to assume a couple of things based on Genesis and what happens after the flood. And they were sacrificing animals to God already. There had already been some revelation about that. So they are making offerings of sheep and oxen in every place, he says, where I cause my name to be remembered. I will come to you and bless you. There it is again. I will come to you, God says. But look what he says in verse 23. And if you make an altar of stone for me. So he says, make an altar of earth. But if you make an altar of stone for me, you shall not build it of cut stones. For if you wield your tool on it, you will profane it. Which is kind of echoing that same idea that Sean mentioned just there. In other words, the worship to God is to be organic worship to God, not arising from our ideals and the work of our hands. So if we make an altar out of stones, then they have to be natural stones untouched by man.
And the same principle applies to music and worship, because a God is again the church. It's organic. It's what God made.
Yep.
He doesn't want to hear an instrument man-made.
It applies to all of our worship. We don't get to build the worship that we conceive. We get to offer the worship that He asked for. If you're going to offer me your sacrifices, then offer them this way. Don't shape them and form them and offer them on an altar that you create. Use that which I create. You shall not go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness may not be exposed upon it. This is also going to have an echo in the future regarding the attire of the high priests as they approach the temple. What he's essentially saying is, look, you don't approach me in such a way that your shame is exposed. And that becomes a theme throughout the Old Testament, where nakedness and shame are interchangeable. All the way back, by the way, to Genesis again. They were naked and they were ashamed. So he's laying out for them, right after the Ten Commandments, some general concepts about they're afraid to approach God, and so he's actually laying a foundation about a way for them to approach God. That's what all this is a discussion about, okay, you're afraid. I want you to tell them that the way they come to me is by doing this and by doing this and by doing this, and then they have nothing to be afraid of. So the very first communication from God after the law is given, when the people become afraid of God and don't want to approach God, is God reaching out yet again and giving the way to come to Him, which is a foreshadowing of the gospel. That's what the gospel is. This is how you can approach me. Why are we afraid of God? He's holy and we're not. What's the outcropping of that? We're worthy of death. God is just, which means if we approach God and we're worthy of death, then we die. But He's made a way. And through that way, we have the forgiveness of sins. We have been redeemed. We have been cleansed. And we have access to God once again. The kind of access that they had in the garden before sin. God is always working to bridge that which keeps us apart. At the same time, He's doing something else. He's working to bridge the distance between us and Him, and to do what? You got to go back to Genesis 15 to get the first inkling of this as well. At the same time that He's seeking to bridge the distance between us and Him, He's seeking to create distance between us and Satan. I'll put enmity between you, He said to Satan, and to the seed of the woman. I will separate you from man and bring man to myself. Is that not the gospel in its core? Reconciliation with God. And so that's where he starts. Now, what happens in the next, particularly the next 21, 22, the next 3 chapters, and really more than that throughout this book. This gets to the part of the book that a lot of people, they like kind of shut it and go, ugh. I actually get excited about this stuff for a lot of reasons. But there's a lot of stuff here. In Exodus 21 through 23, which we'll be covering over the next few weeks, it covers a variety of laws. And on the surface, when you read these 3 chapters, and again, he gets up into a lot more detail later on in the book, and more importantly, in the book of Leviticus and later books in Deuteronomy, a lot more detail about the laws themselves. But it looks like on the surface that the things that he's talking about here in these next 2 or 3 chapters are completely unrelated. What is he talking about here? Well, he talks about slavery. He talks about personal injury. He talks about, well, by the way, I'll mention that personal injury also applies to personal injury to unborn children, which, to me, the strongest argument about the personhood of the unborn child is that God preserved the unborn child as someone who can be injured and someone needs to pay a cost for injuring. They are a person, even before they're born. So personal injury, animal liability, theft and property, sexual morality. What in the world does theft and sexual immorality have to do with each other? And yet they're sandwiched right up against one another as you go down through this list. Sorcery and idolatry, treatment of the vulnerable people in society, lending and laws about lending, respect for God, leaders and offerings, justice, Sabbath rest in chapter 23, worship and festivals at the end of chapter 23. What do those things have to do with each other? Well, they're actually unified by several key principles that tie them together. First is the general context of the covenant. These are principles of this covenant that God is entering into with these people. Remember, that's where this started. And they said, yes, we want to be in this covenant. Okay, now here's the fine details of what that means if you're in a covenant relationship with me. So that's the general overarching principle, but there's more important things than that. Justice and righteousness prevail through all of this. In every one of these things, he's talking about being just, being upright, being fair, being honest in every relationship that man sustains. No matter what that relationship is, whether it's social, whether it's familial, no matter where you find yourself. There is this principle of justice and righteousness that must rule in the life of someone who is in a covenant relationship with God. Questions or comments? I see wheels going in people's heads. All right, so we're going to be quiet right now. All right, social responsibility. Are we responsible to society? Yes. We have some obligations, some responsibility that we're going to have to answer for. Yes, ma'am. In a covenant relationship with God, in fellowship with God. Social responsibility, the protection of the vulnerable members of society, very important. And if the people of God don't recognize that they have an obligation to make sure that the weakest among us are cared for. Because, listen, we are those weak people. And if we're in a position to render help to them, what more can we do to imitate God than to help the helpless? That's exactly what God's doing for us, is helping the helpless, right? While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. We can't help ourselves, so he had to come down and help us. And so Jesus would say, if you even give a cup of cold water in my name to one who needs it, that's being like me. If you clothe those that are naked, James would later say, if you say to someone, go, be warmed and filled, but you do nothing to make that happen, what good is that? So there is an aspect about being righteous and being in fellowship with God and being like God that requires us to meet those needs. Personal responsibility and accountability. You'll notice that Every one of these things is about me, not about us. It's about what I do, how I live, the choices I make, and the answer that I'll have to give. 99.9% of walking as a child of God is accomplished by you as an individual. It is not mostly corporate. It is almost entirely individual. And that is a significant thing to learn. He's showing that through all of these things in all areas of life. The responsibility falls on me. Restorative justice, that's a recurring theme through here. That if you do harm someone, and let's be frank, that's something we all do. Not that we all should do, but something that we all do. Indeed, there's not a righteous man on earth who continually practices righteousness and who never sins. We all have sinned, so we all have hurt someone. He says, look, there's a principle of restorative justice. That you try to set people back to the way they were before you hurt them. By the way, we still carry that over into our legal system to this very day in this country. The idea of our civil court system is to set people back as close to their condition before you hurt them as you possibly can. And occasionally, we have double and treble damages, which also appear in this text, to try to compensate for damages that can't be compensated for. And so the specific laws in this chapter may cover a wide range of topics. They're unified in this emphasis on justice, on responsibility, on accountability, and on conventional faithfulness to God. Being faithful to the covenant of God in every respect of our lives. And so what would Jesus teach about that? That we have to give God our whole heart, our whole body, our whole mind. That there's nothing that we hold back from God. How important is it for us to respond to his coming to us by offering ourselves to him? We just studied about that. Was that Sunday night? Living sacrifice? Or was that Sunday morning? It was Sunday. It was one of the lessons on Sunday. Offer yourself as a living sacrifice, which is your reasonable service. That is your reasonable response to a God who came down to the earth and communicated with you, telling you what you needed to do so that you could approach him once again without dying. So that you didn't have to be afraid of him. And you got to keep in mind again that Jesus would teach that perfect love does what? Cast out fear. Well, what does love look like? Go to the words of Jesus for that as well. If you love me, you'll keep my commandments. If I love God and I keep his commandments and I walk in righteousness, I don't have any reason to fear. Completed love casts out any reason to fear. I'm not afraid of judgment, so that as it would later be reflected in the writings of the New Testament, come Lord Jesus, come quickly. You're not afraid for the Lord to come for judgment if you can come to the point that you're like the Apostle Paul and say, look, I've been poured out as a drink offering. The life that I've lived in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God. So he said what? Did he have any fear of judgment and death? No. In fact, he said it was very much better to die, because what was in store for him? I go to be with the Lord. In the future there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, he would also say, which the righteous judge will award to me on that day. He had no fear of judgment because he knew that the end was to dwell with Jesus. 50 seconds early. I set a timer. Anybody have any questions or comments? What we're going to do going forward is dive into these laws. I'm telling you, this is fun stuff. And I'm not sure that we have exhaustive pictures of any of these laws in this context right here. But boy, there's some good stuff to talk about that governs the way that we think about how we live and treat people, how we look at various relationships with God, with man, both family and neighbor and foreigner, both those that we control and those that control us. How we look toward those who have authority over us, how we exercise authority over others. All those things are touched on in the coming chapters. And so look forward to this discussion. I appreciate the involvement in the discussion tonight as well.